Ever wonder what poses the biggest security threat to Starlink? Coming up. With a system as big and complex as Starlink, it can be difficult to know what your biggest security risk is. When you're looking at these types of problems, a common tool used is threat modeling. The idea is you look at your overall system and dig into each different threat from each different angle to try to understand where your biggest risk is. For each threat, you're looking at the probability that it could happen, and then the impact if it did happen. And these together give you an idea of where your biggest risk lies. So I thought it would be interesting to do a threat modeling session on Starlink. When I'm doing threat modeling in my day job, I usually like to use a whiteboard. It makes it very easy to draw large pictures of the system without getting bogged down into the details until you need to. Whiteboard isn't really going to work that well on video, so what I'm going to try is actually drawing on an iPad and sharing the video with you guys. So what I want to do is dive in and take a look at how that high-level threat modeling normally goes. So typically you want to start off with a high-level view of the system. So I'm going to draw the Earth. And then over on one side, I'm going to draw the Internet. And everyone knows the Internet is always a cloud. Now, specifically here, I'm drawing the Internet that exists today, so not including Starlink. And then over on the other side, I'm going to draw a person. You'll see pretty quick that drawing is not my strong point, but it's good enough. And the person over here wants access to the Internet but doesn't have it today. So what they'll have is a new Starlink dish on a UFO on a stick. And over by the Internet, we're going to have, and again, I'm dramatically simplifying things here, we're going to have a bigger dish. This symbolizes the SpaceX ground stations for Starlink. And then up in the sky, we're going to have a satellite. So I'm going to draw a flat panel satellite with a solar array. And the idea is when the person wants to access the Internet, their dish will send a signal to the Starlink satellite, and that Starlink satellite will beam the signal back down to the ground station and establish a two-way link so that that user can access the Internet. So at a high level, for just a basic operation, these are the core pieces of the system. Okay, so now I'm going to draw it again with a little bit more detail that's relevant for the security discussion. So I'm still going to have my Internet cloud, but now I'm going to draw two ground stations. 1 and 2. Now both ground stations are connected to the Internet. And I'm also going to draw SpaceX here now. I'm just going to draw it as one big office building here, but SpaceX also has a connection to maybe one or more ground stations and also to the Internet, which then connects to all of the other ground stations. And they're responsible for managing the infrastructure. Now over on the other side, we still have our Internet user, but we've got a little bit more detail there. We know they have the Starlink Wi-Fi router, and that's connected with power over Ethernet to the user terminal. And then now, instead of just one satellite, I'm going to draw two satellites. So one flat panel there, with its solar array. And then we'll draw one over, let's say here, with its solar array. And I'll make these a little bit thicker, because now we're going to look at the links between them. So just like before, we had the RF link from the satellite to the user terminal, and the RF link from the satellite to the ground terminal, and that would be the same for this dish here. We also have the optical links, which will eventually go from satellite to satellite. So I'll draw that as a red sort of laser line there. And I'm going to draw a second RF signal to the ground station by SpaceX, just to signify that that might be a particular RF link dedicated for telemetry and command and control. So not sharing data, but actually controlling the constellation itself. And that signal would just go to SpaceX headquarters or wherever this constellation was managed. So that's a more complex, maybe more realistic view of the system. So once we've got a high-level view of the system, in most threat modeling, you try to identify what the valuable things are, what might motivate somebody to actually poke around or try to get into your system or use it incorrectly. So if we look at Starlink, there's a couple different aspects we probably want to consider. The first is maybe you've got somebody who just wants free internet access. So they just want to get online and they don't want to pay for it. Another aspect is maybe that same person, it's not so much that they want it free, they want it to be anonymous. They don't even mind paying, they just don't want anyone to know who's paying. Another angle is this person here. There might be other people who want to know where that person is. So can somebody geolocate and find that person when they don't want to necessarily be found? Another goal, maybe a third party wants to block access for that person, denial of service, prevent them from getting on the internet. Along the similar vein, maybe they want to deny access to the whole service, prevent everyone from getting online, or maybe just deny service to a particular region. So preventing, say, the citizens of a country from getting online, or the position of a riot, preventing people in that riot zone from getting online. Another possible target is maybe people don't want to disrupt service, but they want to listen in. They want to know what this person's doing, how they're communicating, how they can listen to their signals to intercept their traffic and read it. Along a similar vein, maybe they don't want to intercept it just to read, but they want to actually filter it and censor it. Along the lines of something like the Great Firewall of China, they maybe want to allow their citizens to access the internet, but at some point in the chain, they want to be able to filter and block certain types of content. Another less technical vector of attack is someone might just want to steal this equipment. It kind of has to be outside so that it has a view of the sky. People might be interested in stealing user terminals, stealing or damaging ground stations, or even stealing one of the satellites. Another relevant example is someone like me. I just want to know how the system works. I don't want to disrupt how it works or even interfere with other operations. I just want to understand how my signal gets around and how it all kind of fits together, how the technology works. So now that we've got a handful of examples on what might motivate somebody to attack the system, let's take a look at various interfaces in the system that they might try to exploit or might try to listen or poke or prod at to get understanding of the system they wouldn't normally have. So I'll start with the user themselves. First is their own equipment. So their own laptops, their own phones. These things are already vulnerable, so it's not really unique to Starlink, so I won't spend much time on that. But that's the kind of endpoint in the chain before it reaches a person. Next is the actual Wi-Fi signals from the Starlink router. After that is the router itself, what people might be able to do with the router, its firmware, its hardware. The connection from the router to the dish, it's another possible point of weakness. The dish itself, so that could be actually tampering with the contents of the dish or just otherwise making it do something that it shouldn't. Next is the RF link from the dish to the satellite. This could be something close to Earth, so a secondary listening device listening to transmissions from the dish. Or it could be something more advanced, listening to signals in both directions, a tap. For very advanced adversaries, it could theoretically be possible to actually man in the middle between the dish and the satellite. Definitely some complexity there, but something worth thinking about. And then for the really advanced attackers, and I'm talking nation states here, maybe putting something at the satellite itself on the RF link, so between the satellite and the user terminal, to either be man in the middle or intercept both sides of the conversation there. Now that we're up in space and talking nation states, the Starlink satellites themselves, so that could be tampering with the hardware before launch. It could be tampering with the software before launch. Could be tampering with the software after launch, like a firmware update style. Or it could even be in-orbit tampering, actually approaching the satellite and directly physically interfacing with it, whatever form that might take. In the denial of service category, it could also be destroying the satellite, just completely removing it from the picture to deny service to its coverage area. In between the satellites, you've got this optical link. It also has opportunities for passive interception or even potentially a man-in-the-middle approach. And then specifically for this satellite, in this picture, tampering with the command and control link with all those same techniques, either passive interception or man in the middle, or particularly in this case, spoofing a ground link connection so that you can make the satellite think that it's talking to the SpaceX ground station, but really it's talking to your malicious ground station. Then down on the ground station, again, is the official ground stations, tampering with those, tampering with the link from the ground station to the internet, and over the internet, the link from the ground stations through to SpaceX, potentially tampering with that link at that stage. And then, of course, tampering with the management system itself at SpaceX headquarters, and that could take many, many different forms. So that's a handful of kind of targets, things that people might try to attack. Other aspects that tie into this system, these satellites need to be replenished. So if you want to interfere with the system, you could also interfere with the launch system, the method that SpaceX puts those satellites up into space. So that could be interfering with the Falcon 9 rocket itself, denying access to space using some other techniques, or potentially, and then this is major attack level, destroying the infrastructure for new launches. So imagine blowing up SpaceX's factories or the launch pads that SpaceX launches the Falcon 9 from. All of these things could potentially be a vector of attack to deny access to space, to prevent them from replenishing their constellation. Another aspect is looking at how somebody could actually accomplish some of these attacks. We talked about some ideas already, but I just want to highlight a few that might be particularly interesting when you look at the scale of this type of system and the interested parties who might not want it to work the way it's supposed to, or might want to have more access than they should. So the first is the hardware devices themselves. So the kind of consumer level, the user terminal, the Starlink router, the power over Ethernet adapter, all of these pieces of equipment have to be made somewhere. So if they're made by a third party, how can you verify that that third party is making them exactly as spec'd and isn't changing anything along the way or introducing vulnerabilities as part of the manufacturing? Second, they are complex devices in themselves. They've got hardware, they've got firmware, they've got software. Those components all come from somewhere, and each of those sources could be a source of a vulnerability. For SpaceX, this risk is somewhat smaller because they're so vertically integrated that most of the components are actually made by SpaceX. That's not full protection, but it definitely helps. Now you have to consider that SpaceX, if they're manufacturing the equipment themselves, they need to be concerned with their own employees, the insider threat. Could an employee at SpaceX have access to either the firmware running in the systems or a remote update firmware that could be installed after the fact to actually cause damage or give access kind of as part of that update process? Same idea with the ground terminals. Those hardware devices, the software that runs them, that all comes from somewhere. If those antennas are purchased from a third-party supplier, can you verify the supplier? There's also supply chain risks. How can you verify that even if it's perfect at the source, that it doesn't get tampered with en route from the source to you? This idea of supply chain kind of manipulation could apply for any of these devices as well, including the subcomponents. If you're using a processor inside the satellite that's manufactured in another country, how can you verify that that component is working exactly like it should and that it hasn't been tampered with either at the source where it's manufactured or en route during shipment before it reaches your factory and gets assembled into the final devices? How can you verify that nothing has been tampered with in that path as well? It's definitely not an easy problem to look at all of these various aspects and kind of get a handle on the biggest risks. If you think that's hard, I'll throw in a really oddball one that they're probably thinking of, or at least I hope is somewhere on their risk register. All of these systems are in space. We already have the idea of a UFO on a stick. What about a real UFO coming in and tampering these things, abducting the satellites, pulling them up to the mothership? Is somebody looking at this problem? I'd be interested to know if this is actually on the risk register for the Starlink constellation. What would they do if the mothership came from space? So that last one was a bit far-fetched, but it just serves to show how complex this type of a system can be and how hard it is to look at all the possible threats and actually understand them. Typically, you look at the whole system first, and then you dive into specific details and spend a bit more time on each. And that's actually how I'm structuring these videos. This is an overview of the whole threat model for the system, and then I'm going to dive into specific details in future videos and look at each individual aspect and see how it applies. Let me know in the comments if you like this kind of content, and hit the like button on the video. It really helps this channel grow. If you want to get notified of future videos in the series, subscribe down below and hit the bell icon. Thanks a lot for watching today. See you next time.